Mike? Hello, hello. Shall we get started? Let's do it. Hello and welcome to Penn Blockchain Conference. My name is Katrina, and it is my great honor to welcome you on behalf of the entire planning team to this historic and gorgeous Penn Museum where we talk about the future of crypto. You see what I did there? Before we get started, please allow me a moment to take you through the journey that got us here. And it's a story about 0 to 1. You should know that we're a student organization, and the key word for the entire conference is that it's student run, which means there are three things. We have no money. We don't have a lot of speakers pounding our door to come speak here because initially they have no idea what to expect. And number three, we don't really have a lot of volunteers initially either. And on top of that, 2 weeks into our planning, FTX imploded, bringing to the maximal FUD of the industry. And I remember texting Chunda and Sophia, well, I guess SBF just got himself uninvited this year. It wasn't an easy journey, I'll be honest, but hey, here we are, and I'm so proud to present to you our 28 carefully curated panels congregating 110 thought leaders in the industry to come together in person in Philly and in February as the first domestic conference of the year to kick off a start of a beautiful year. There's no shilling here. Just meet of great minds to talk about the next iteration of crypto. We're also proud to announce that we've attracted 200 hackers from top 22 universities across the globe to come together and hack crypto. Of course, Chunda and Sophia will tell you more about the hackathon in just a minute, but before we get there, I'm just standing here so grateful to every single person that made this possible. So if I could have your attention to the screen. This is the small but mighty team that made this possible. They've worked tirelessly over the past weeks, month, for nothing but a passion for the industry. And many of them will actually be joining the workforce in the upcoming month. So please keep an eye out for these great candidates. Next. We also want to thank our sponsors for opening up your bags in the depth of a crypto winter. There are a lot of other things you could have done with it, but instead, you decided to invest in Penn, in us, in the future of talent. And last but not least, thank you to all 110 speakers. You're all leaders in your respective field, took time off your calendar, fly across the country, across the Atlantic to join us. And I especially want to thank those who actually said yes to me in 2022 without knowing what PBC is. There was a cold start problem, and it's because of you that we are here today. All right, now, a little bit about the programming. It is a 2x2 conference, meaning we have 2 auditoriums and 2 days of programming. There's also a hackathon happening concurrently, which now I'll pass to Chunda and Sophia to tell you about the hackathon and also more about Penn Blockchain as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. Can we just give a big round of applause to Kat because she's been spearheading this entire conference. I'll give a brief overview of Penn Blockchain and a little bit of our history, but first I'll introduce myself. My name is Sophia, and this is Chunda. We're the co-presidents of Penn Blockchain, and we've been working very hard to put this on and really facilitate everything over the past few years. But Penn Blockchain is essentially an organization that seeks to bring people together. So we are spanning all the different schools, whether engineering, business, graduate, undergraduate, and we bring everyone together into one organization called Penn Blockchain here for students. And we also seek to be the center of academia, so we obviously are an academic institution, but also syncing them with financial institutions, governmental institutions, and also the broad swath of the broader crypto ecosystem and entrepreneurs there. But we seek to bring everyone together. I'll give a little bit of our history as well. So we were founded in 2017 by a few graduate students and a few undergraduate students, which was the start of bringing everyone together. And we hosted our first conference in 2018. We hosted another conference in person in 2019, of course, at a much smaller scale. In 2020, we were definitely taken a toll by COVID. So at this time, this was actually when Chunda and I came in as freshmen to UPenn. The club was just us two and a handful of other people. And over the past 2 years, we've spent a ton of time trying to grow it and expand it to be the club that it is now. Over 400 members with 90 core contributors to our committees, which Chunda will talk about a little bit later. And I'll pass it off to him to give a few more details about the club.
And now with us today, we're part of a coalition of over 8 schools, of which are the leading organizations in the blockchain ecosystem. These are names you might recognize: Blockchain at Berkeley, Blockchain at UCLA, some of which might already be in the crowd. But over that, and more than that, we have over 60 universities in our general network, of which 25 we decided to invite to the hackathon with us for this weekend. And of those 25, we decided to sponsor over 100 students, both lodging and flights, to be able to come and join us and participate in this conference and in building things for themselves as well. And of course, we'd like to thank not only them and our extended network, but our network here at home as well. The Penn students and alumni really make what this organization is, and so are the Quaker Dow Network, which is the network of over 600 alums, founders, investors, current students, and people who were with us this entire way. And to go a little bit into who we are and what we do and how we've been contributing to this ecosystem for the past 6 or so years, our first focus has always been education first. So we run a semesterly education program that runs with new students every single semester, of which we use that as a pipeline to kind of funnel them into our ecosystem contributions, with the focus on building skill sets, interests, and a passion for a specific sector of the industry. And these sectors kind of manifest themselves within these committees that we have. And so we'll start with investments, which does venture capital work and works with several venture capital firms in the ecosystem, doing everything from due diligence to sourcing. We have a governance team, which is really active in the governance forums and works with several of the prominent delegates in the ecosystem. We have our development team, which does the ecosystem work from 0 to 1 and also joins protocols full time. Additionally, we have our research team, which does in-house work, which you can see on our socials. And then also on top of that, does research grants for all the types of the protocols in the ecosystem that will be speaking with us today. Next, we have our operations team, which is the meat and bones of really what makes Penn Blockchain more of a community than it is just a club. The operations team really brings people together and allows students to not only experience crypto here, but abroad, bringing students to conferences and other events and different ecosystem kind of communities. And finally, last but not least, we have the events team, which make things like this possible. They're the ones who kind of help coordinate along with us to really make sure that everything here is going along smoothly and that we've been able to bring everyone from all over the place here today. And now I'll pass it back over to Sophia to go over a little bit more details about some logistics.
Yes. And before we do that, I just want to say that our club really views itself as more than a club, and that's why we've been able to, and I've put on all these relevant panels today, and hopefully you find them super interesting. We want to serve the ecosystem and be more than just someone for our student body. But a few resources before we get started. You all should have your emails with confirmation, and in that you should have links to the Telegram, to the web app, and also to some of the maps. I know it might be hard to navigate a little bit around the museum at time, but all the volunteers who are designated with the pink shirts will be able to help you throughout. So those are some main resources, and without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first keynote panel, which is centered around legal and regulatory issues. This is especially relevant in the past few months with a lot of different legislation coming out, but very relevant in the last 24 hours if you've seen what happened with Kraken and with staking and the policy that was made there. So I'd love to introduce Hester Peirce and Louis Cohen, and we'll bring them out in just a second. Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
So shall we kick off? I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to let you, Commissioner Peirce, introduce yourself. I'll say a few words of introduction myself, and I think we'll have a really interesting discussion.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. So it's really an honor to be here this morning, and it's an honor to be here with Louis talking about some of our favorite issues. I'm Hester Peirce. I've been a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission since 2018. And I have to give you my disclaimer, which is that my views are my own views, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. Louis, do you have any disclaimers?
My name is Louis Cohen. I'm a co-founder of DLX Law, which is a law firm based in New York, Wilmington, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., and I feel pretty comfortable saying I'm speaking on behalf of my firm, so it's great to be here, Commissioner Peirce. We have a reasonably finite period of time. We're going to endeavor to take questions at the end of our discussion, so if we touch on something of interest, we'll try and hit at least 2 or 3 questions. Commissioner, today is a fairly auspicious day because yesterday your commission announced an important settlement of an enforcement action involving staking as a service with an entity that trades under the name Kraken. And there are interesting questions about the nature of their activity, but you filed a dissent, and in your dissent you focused less on the company's activities and more on process. Can you tell us a little more about what made you file that consent and where some of your concerns were about the process?
I think the concerns that I laid out in that dissent are similar to concerns I've expressed elsewhere, which is that the SEC's approach has been one in which we've used enforcement as a way, and yesterday quite explicitly so, as a way to say to people, this is how we view this activity, and everyone needs to come in and register. And I just don't think that that's the way to approach something like this. Staking is something that we've been aware of for quite some time now, and we have not put anything out there in the form of guidance or we've not tried to sit down with people in the industry to think about what registration might look like. And so instead, it's just this sort of arbitrary timing and arbitrary, we're just choosing an entity and we're bringing an enforcement action in the way that we did. That really bothers me. I put some of the blame on myself in the sense that I should have called for guidance on staking as a service before this time, but I just think there's a better way to do it. In fact, we have a tool that we could have used, which is a 21A report, which is a way of bringing a quasi-enforcement action, but it really is a way of saying, this is how we view things, and then people can know from that, but it's not a full-blown enforcement action. And in this instance, what I found particularly remarkable is that our solution to the problem of there being an unregistered activity is just to say, okay, here's the deal. You have to shut down the activity. You're not allowed to restart it, even if you do register, and you can't serve American customers anymore in this staking service. What kind of a solution is that? To me, that's just saying we don't want to deal with the problem, and it's too hard. So, Louis, I want to turn it back to you and ask you, because I know crypto is not your first rodeo. You were involved in asset-backed securities and thinking about how the regulation and registration would work for ABS. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think we can draw parallels from the past.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And I think I've frequently looked at the realm of asset-backed securities or securitizations as a model potentially for addressing some of the concerns in crypto. Asset-backed securities are usually structured as legal entities that hold a pool of typically financial assets, mortgages, credit card receivables, auto loans, et cetera. They raise capital typically by selling debt instruments, sometimes equity instruments. But the investor, in considering those decisions, isn't really concerned about the typical things that an investor in a company would be concerned about: management, financial statements, a range of other things, regulatory risks, litigation, many of the things that our standard disclosure rules apply to. So attempting to file a registration statement for an issuer of asset-backed securities and using the standard disclosure regime is challenging, if not impossible. Back rather terrifyingly when I was in high school in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I had the pleasure of working with the Commission and the CorpFin staff to craft new disclosure rules that would make sense in the context of these asset-backed issuers. And the staff and the Commission carved out exceptions to, for example, the need for financial statements. They were not relevant, and instead required other disclosures which were material. For example, very granular information about the historical performance of the assets. I think one possible path forward would be for the Commission to look at some of these situations like staking as a service, think about what disclosures are relevant or material, what can be waived, and perhaps where new and other relevant disclosures can be added.
Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful thing to do, recognizing, yeah, there's information that people might want to have, customers might want to have. What is that information? Instead of thinking about it just in terms of fitting something in a regulatory box for the sake of putting it in a regulatory box. So I want to take you back to the test everyone knows about, which is the Howey test, but I want to do it in a little bit of a different way and say, Louis, you're now the general counsel of the Howey Corporation, and you want to comply with the law here. So you're looking at this situation and you want to register these investment contracts. What are you going to do?
You know, it's a fascinating question, Commissioner, and it's one that I think really bears some reflection. If, as exactly as you say, the W.J. Howey Company had a general counsel who scratched her head and said, well, we have these kind of relatively new federal laws about securities. Do you think perhaps we're engaging in securities activity? I know we seem to just be selling plots of land and management contracts, but it feels like this might kind of align with our securities laws. Let's go talk to the commission and work something out. What would that have looked like? And clearly, we would have wanted some kind of registration that took into account the risks and the issues that people investing in that scheme might face. They might want to, for example, craft a regime that looks at what are the obligations as a holder of the land. Is there any liquidity in that land? Could you later resell it, and to whom? Will you be stuck selling it back to Howie, and are they a price maker and that you have no choice over? What about the land management? What experience do they have? What commitments have they made? Do you have adequate information about the Howie team's ability to service those orange groves? Are there alternative providers that you should know about? So I think you could imagine a really interesting sort of counterfactual environment where the Howie company took the decision to engage, the commission met that, and came up with disclosure standards that could be followed, in a practical way.
Well, I wish that the Howie General Counsel had been that far-sighted. Then we might not be in the situation we're in now, because we might actually have some sort of registration regime that made sense. But I mean, that's orange groves, oranges. We're talking digital assets. This is more complicated. So taking us into the modern era, how do you think about digital assets? Are they different than orange groves?
That's a tough question, right? Because, you often hear a refrain that oranges are not securities, and, oranges are not securities. But as you ask, digital assets also really aren't oranges either. They're different. They're created by a particular individual or development team. They're finite in supply by plan. They are intended to capture the value of a computer network. And so the kinds of disclosures that might be appropriate for example, an issuer of asset-backed securities, or perhaps a company that is selling orange groves and management contracts, don't really make sense. It's a much more challenging kind of situation, and I think as market participants, it's really on all of us to think about how we ensure that people who are engaging with these networks have the information they need to make good and informed decisions. And I'd break that down really into two different categories. The first category is when the digital assets are initially being distributed. We've seen different frameworks. Commissioner Peirce, you've created a framework yourself known as the Safe Harbor, and you adapted it as Safe Harbor 2.0. A group of lawyers in the space created something called Regulation X, which they publish, which created disclosures. There are other disclosure frameworks that are out there. We need creative solutions so that the kinds of unique issues that digital assets present are disclosed in a way that makes sense. That's one category. The other category, I think, is when digital assets trade in secondary markets. And particular in a speech you gave at Duke University a couple of weeks ago, you noted, quite appropriately in my view, that it's inherent in the nature of blockchain-based economic systems that digital assets are free and available to trade. Without being able to trade them, this system fundamentally doesn't work. But it raises the somewhat obvious question, well, what disclosures are needed there? And they may not be the same disclosures that are relevant when digital assets are initially being distributed, but they're still very important, and we need to give more thought. As a community, I think you've admonished the community on a number of occasions, Commissioner, that we need to do more to be creative, and I think we have seen things like Regulation S and other initiatives. We've seen some private market participants file rulemaking proceedings and asking important questions. We need to keep doing that, I think, to really get at those difficult questions. What's appropriate disclosure in a world of digital assets?
So I think when I'm thinking about my role, as we have a mission that's threefold, right? We've got to protect investors, facilitate capital formation, and protect, ensure the integrity of the marketplace, essentially. So when I look out at digital assets, and I think when my colleagues look out at digital assets, they see a real need for disclosure around that, as you talked about. And so I think that's driving some of this desire to think about the digital assets themselves as being the securities, which means then all these obligations flow from that. But you actually, and some colleagues recently wrote an interesting article, which is really, it's really given me a lot of food for thought in how we ought to be thinking about this. So can you just talk a little bit about kind of what motivated you to undertake this article? It's a 180-page article, some of which is tables and charts going through lots of different cases, but what motivated you to write this article, and how do you think that article can help us as a society think through what the right regime is for regulating digital assets, if there should be such a regime?
Well, I'm tempted to say under wrong answers only mental illness motivated me, but that's probably not exactly true. It was a sense of frustration that those looking at this, and that includes very much not only regulators, academics, other practitioners, really weren't delving into the jurisprudence around this as much as was really required. What we were seeing was, what I felt at least, was relatively surface level analysis driven primarily by what we kind of loosely call the ICO boom of the 2015, 16, 17, 18 era, where fundraising transactions took place and people provided money with hopes of getting a return based on newly created digital assets. Interestingly, the former chair of the commission testified before Congress in a slightly nuanced version of a statement we've heard several times and said, every ICO I've seen is a security. And really that was kind of the basis of our thinking. I think that's largely correct. Those fundraising transactions were indeed, I think in most cases, securities transactions, and there was unequivocally abuse of the ability to sort of loosely merge crowdfunding, which was itself very new at that time, with this. But along with that, nobody sort of took on the question, well, what exactly is that securities transaction and how does it relate to the digital asset? So what we sought to do by going back through every, appellate Howey cases, about 260 odd cases, and looking at them for some clues, and I think the clear takeaway for us is in a very small but not irrelevant number of cases, we saw actual financial instruments that didn't really fit a neat category, and those unusual financial instruments were investment contracts and probably appropriately were regulated as such, particularly the non-tradable capital shares in Sherapnin as an example. And there are some others, VALIC, is it? The variable annuities cases. Those are our financial instruments. They have an issuer, they have rights and obligations, but in the vast majority of cases, are not like that. They involve an object, some sort of asset, be they the oranges or the many animals grown for their pelts, the whiskey, the myriad sort of amusement earthworms, of course, who can forget one of the greatest hits. And these schemes, the object was never the security. And so we really wanted to delve into that. And our conclusion, of course, is that where you have an investment contract, but the asset or the object being sold does not itself create rights or obligations, that asset, when sold later, be it a Beanie Baby, an earthworm or whiskey, even if its value was in some way dependent on others, the asset itself is not a security. And that's kind of the TLDR version of 180 pages, sparing you the effort.
So, that TLDR, though, I think the implication is that we at the SEC can't reach that object. And that seems to me problematic if you're the SEC and you're not only trying to reach the object and trying to get people to provide disclosure around the object, but you're also trying to regulate the platforms on which they trade and anything that kind of touches those objects. So what's your solution to that? Look, I have to be candid in that I'm sort of on one side of the spectrum, and I think that people can engage in voluntary transactions as long as both are entering into it voluntarily, and we don't have to slap regulation on everything people do. But I think a lot of people, especially in 2023, after the year we had in 2022, are definitely looking for a regulatory framework. So what do you draw from your article in terms of implications for the regulatory system, and what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think you make some really important points there, Commissioner, because really, I think it's important to situate securities as a subset of commercial activity, and one where, for policy reasons, Congress determined that it was appropriate to create a federal regulatory framework. The problem is, where do you delineate that? Where's the perimeter of that regulatory framework? And that really raises the question. To the extent, as you rightly point out, we argue that most of these digital assets are not themselves securities. Does that mean, fraud, scams, and abuse ahoy? Is that really the world that any of us want? And I think the answer is no. And I think we have to acknowledge that this is a sort of different framework, because it's one that doesn't fit in Howie. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have appropriate regulations and rules around it that help guide civil behavior, civil commercial behavior. And I think one way of getting at that would require some congressional action. And when we look at these digital assets, Commissioner, what we see is not necessarily a security, but what we do see is a scheme, one in which projects are able to fundraise by creating assets that have at least the potential of being highly liquid in the future. And that ability to create a system like that allows many projects to fundraise, where they otherwise wouldn't have. And so a framework that attached disclosure rules to the people who benefited from that, at least prospective liquidity, that potential liquidity, to me would make a lot more sense, and imposing on those projects disclosure obligations that would be broadly aligned with the nature of the assets and the risks, kind of like with Howie and the oranges. And I think Congress can and really should act to create some sort of additional framework. So just because we argue that many digital assets are not securities doesn't mean there shouldn't be regulation. In the interim, I don't think anyone should ever take our article as anything other than advocacy for policy positions. I just admonish, I'll do my own admonishment, everybody should follow the guidance of the SEC as and until rules go otherwise. So please don't take it as a license to do whatever you want, but to think about how do we as a community advocate for better rules going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that the guidance from the SEC, it's a little difficult for me to follow internally where, we've got to tie it back to the securities laws, right? And so the initial offering, often those are designed in a way that looks an awful lot like a securities offering, and that's one thing. But I think as we talked about before we got on stage, a lot of that initial activity now is being done in sales to accredited investors, which means that they can generally, if they do it right, they can avoid having to register that offering. But what we now are trying to do, I think, at the SEC is we really do want to be able to view those secondary transactions as being within our realm of authority. I mean, the thing that I find kind of funny is we look at, the value of this token depends on what others are doing, the efforts of others, and I look and I think, well, sometimes what the value of the token depends on is what the SEC is planning to do with respect to taking an enforcement action or not, but I don't know how that works into the securities laws. But so let me put you in another role. Now you're chairman of the SEC. Your first 100 days, you need to hit the ground running here. What are your plans?
Well, that's happily not something I'm terribly worried about happening in real life, but maybe somebody wants to make a TV show. I think it is an important question. I think we have to recognize, and I feel, Commissioner, that this is a two-way street. We've had a bit of a breakdown in the relationship between the market and the market community and the regulators, all of whom I think want to get to a common goal of civil commercial activity. But it's sort of, nobody's listening to each other right now. So I think if I were in our imaginary world appointed commissioner, one of the things I'd want to start with is a town hall or a series of town halls and give both the staff and the commissioners of the SEC and the community an opportunity to listen to each other. Just backstage a little while ago, we had the pleasure of a couple of the amazing Penn students stop by and say hello and say a few words. And there are people who are sincere and really interested, and I'd like their voices to be heard, in the halls of power, and for people, on the other hand, in the crypto community, to listen to, senior and career enforcement staff and the kind of experiences they've had and the concerns that they have, which are in many cases are very legitimate. And I feel like if both sides could stop, kind of warring with each other on Twitter and do a little more listening to each other, I think we'd be in a lot better shape.
Yeah, and sometimes that sounds like a very simple solution, right? Well, let's just start talking, but it can really be hard to do. And I know that I've asked, along with some colleagues from the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, that we think about doing joint roundtables with the CFTC, SEC, and people in the community, and throw in investor protection or whatever you want to call it, consumer protection advocates. That's fine too. Anyone who's interested in being in the room, and let's have that conversation. Let's think about what problem we're trying to solve first, right? Let's not just. The problem can't just be, well, you need to comply with the securities laws or the CFTC's rules. The problem needs to be, look, we see activity and we're concerned about our investor protection objectives. How are we going to solve that problem? And when it comes to decentralized protocols, maybe the solution is, hey, you know what? The fact that something's decentralized, that it's in open source code, that everyone participates on the same terms, that you know what you're getting into when you get into that there's no centralized intermediary, that actually takes care of some of the problems that regulation otherwise would solve. So maybe we can set some of decentralized land aside and really concentrate on activity that involves centralized entities at some point in the process. How do we deal with that activity? And I do think that my colleagues at the SEC, you've got to remember, people who are in enforcement at the SEC, and we talked about this before we came on stage as well, people in enforcement see just a string of really bad activity, and so they tend to view the world through that lens. But it's important for them to be able to interact with people who are trying to build things and understand what things those are. And I think it's particularly difficult in this area because a lot of you all who are building things are not coming from a traditional financial entity world. You're not coming from a big law firm. You're coming from the world of actually knowing the technical aspects of what you're doing. And so trying to interact with us is difficult. I do think it's important, but I think we at the SEC need to be willing to have those conversations. And part of the frustration that you sometimes see coming out of my statements is that I think we haven't been willing to have those conversations in the way we need to have them. You can't just say to people, come in and talk to us, and then expect people to wait for 2 or 3 years while their legal bills are mounting and their funders are saying, we can't sit here forever while you do nothing waiting for SEC approval. We can't have that kind of situation, and we can't work these situations out in the context of enforcement actions where you're in a settled, everyone's trying to get to a settlement. They don't really care about what the implications of, I'm not saying they don't care, but the implications, the broader implications are not front of mind. That's not a healthy way to do it. We need to have some sort of public dialogue, and we need to, I always like to underscore this, we need to remember that government does work for the public in the United States, and so the public needs to be involved in deciding where is government regulation an appropriate solution and where is it not. We can't get away from that. We have to kind of bring it back to first principles sometimes.
I think those are really important points, Commissioner. And one of the things I see when we looked at crypto is really a technology that has a fundamental effect on the relationship of the individual and the government. And I think that doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all or that we shouldn't live in a civilized society, but I think we do need to think a little bit more about how we do relate. I sometimes analogize to if Satoshi Nakamoto hadn't invented a way to move value from point to point without any intermediaries. What if he or she had had developed a way to move people, sort of Star Trek-wise, from one location to another. You don't go through airports anymore, just the same way that money doesn't have to travel through banks. We have to re-examine then, how do we frame that activity? Just telling people don't do that is not effective. And I think, you've been a strong advocate for coming up with ways. Again, I don't think most people in the crypto community say, let's abandon rules and regulations, but let's fit them for purpose of a world where people do have more individual liberties, and let's think about how those liberties are attenuated.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think it's also important not to put the regulator in the place of assessing whether or not something is going to be useful, right? Because it really doesn't matter what the regulator thinks about utility. The regulator has objectives, and we have to fulfill those objectives, but I'm not in the position of assessing whether or not there's merit in something. That's for all of you to figure that out. And I think as regulators, we sometimes slip into the role of trying to say, well, this is going to be good for you or this is going to be bad for you. And that has led, I think, to a lot of problems in the way we approach regulation in this space as well. So we need, again, to remember that that's not going to be very productive if we go down that road. I don't know, do we want to open it up now for questions? Or
Absolutely.
does anyone have questions?
I think we have a mic there.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Bruno Faviero. I'm a founder, I'm a venture capitalist, I'm a developer. And you talked earlier about how, sometimes it does feel very disconnected, these great halls of power and the voices in them, be they the politicians or the K Street law firms. I saw DLX has an office right up on Northwest 23rd. What can we do as members of the ecosystem in the community, if anything, to have any kind of influence over these types of conversations and the outcomes that we can have in a productive way?
I mean, I would say you can come share your stories. Come talk to me and my colleagues at the commission. If you're just coming in generally, it may be helpful to come in at the commissioner level, try to make an appointment. We have an open door. Have an idea of what you want to say and what problems you think that they're concerned about, right? And what your solutions are to those problems. There's a lot of activity, obviously, in DC happening. There are a lot of groups that speak for the industry or parts of the industry, and that's I think helpful to the discussion. But I guess one concrete thing that I really am thinking about now is how do I approach decentralization and think about, again, how it's different from centralized crypto, and where appropriate lines would be. How can I work on building protections around some of the activity in that space? So that's one concrete thing I'm looking for input on, but I think it's important for you all with stories of what you're building to go talk to my colleagues as well. I don't know, Louis, if you have any suggestions.
I think that's right, and I can just say as a member of the private sector, not only your office, Commissioner, but other of the commissioners and the staff have been very open in terms of talking with us. I think we've sort of degraded a little bit over time as there have been some pushback in all directions, but I think you're absolutely right to say the best way to engage is civil discussion and come in and make proposals that are thoughtful. Again, I called out previously Regulation X, that a group that calls themselves Lexpunk did, but that was a great deal of time and effort was put into that to create a constructive and industry-led solution, and I think we should be calling those efforts out. You have in some of your speeches, and I think that's important to recognize that, and others can do that as well. Make a proposal, write something, it'll be seen.
And my advice too is that the government does belong to you. It is not the other way, and so you can go in your head held high. You don't have to, you're as much a voice that needs to be heard as someone who walks in a three-piece suit and knows everyone at the commission. I think we really need to underscore that, and if we don't continue to underscore that, we're going to end up in a very bad situation in this country where it's flipped, and people in government look at themselves as being the ones who are running the show. It really has to be the other way. We at the agencies we have our accountability through Congress, because they're the ones who are elected, right? But so that relationship really needs to stay in the right order. Any other questions?
Gentleman over here.
Thank you, Commissioner Peirce. Seth Gins from Coin Fund. I think it's fair to kind of distill down your argument in the dissent yesterday as being a due process argument in kind of the broadest sense of that phrase. Have you gotten responses to that either in this instance or having conversations with Congress around this due process idea or lack of due process around crypto regulation?
Responses from inside or outside the commission?
From outside the commission. So what's been the congressional response to yesterday's dissent or to prior dissents or conversations around that due process idea?
Well, I think there is definitely interest in Congress in thinking about whether regulators, including the SEC, are approaching the process correctly here. And I think, people mock the regulation by enforcement theme that sort of was underlying that dissent and underlies a lot of critiques. But I think that sort of dismissive view of the regulation by enforcement really misses the point that we're all trying to get to the right place, which is figuring out where regulation should play a role and what that regulation should look like. But it's actually much more efficient not to do these one-off actions, which will take thousands of years for us to do, but to do something that applies more broadly and makes sense more broadly. I mean, the range of responses ranges from "you suck," "you should resign," "you're an embarrassment," you've been dissenting for years and you've accomplished nothing," to "yeah, we think you're right, and how do we figure out a way to get to a better place." But I think that does require people talking to my colleagues on the commission and saying it's not that we're a lawless industry, it's that we are trying to figure out how we can actually move forward in a way that doesn't prevent us from doing what we're trying to do. Because I mean, yesterday's decision basically said, well, just shut it down, right? I mean, that can't be the answer. So I think you all need to go and talk to my colleagues and say, okay, let's put on the table that shut it all down is not a good solution. It might be easier for you, the regulator. That's not going to cut it. Here are some ways that we could achieve what you're trying to achieve in a pragmatic, practical way that would actually still allow us to do what we're trying to do. So I think it's we'll see if the conversation can move forward in a productive way.
And Commissioner, perhaps in that regard, I think one thing we can take note of is the fact that outside of the United States, we're seeing different policy responses. So this is not to say that, sometimes other jurisdictions can go in wrong directions and we do a better job. We absolutely may, but then again, we may not. And I think, have you looked at all at, in particular, the markets for crypto asset regulation in Europe, not yet in effect, and other regulatory schemes? I think it's just interesting to note that there's not only one way to do policy in this space.
Yeah, I find it pretty interesting that Europe has been a little bit more forward-thinking in terms of, yeah, you know what, we're going to put together a regulatory framework. That framework is going to be, it covers a lot of different things, and it's going to be difficult, I think, in actually implementing it, putting it into place. There are going to be difficult questions. But I really admire the fact that they just, grabbed the bull by the horns and started writing a framework. There's an argument, too, that you don't want to write a framework too early in the game because you don't want to constrain it based on what you know now. But I do think we have something to learn from that. And usually I'm not trying to emulate Europe, I have to say, because I think we have a much more dynamic, innovative culture here. But I think in that regard, they're trying to put a legal framework so that people can actually do things. And I think that's exciting.
I think maybe we have time for a couple more questions. Let's see.
Maybe we can do around 2 more questions or so.
2 more. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Where am I going?
There was one right down here. And I don't know, there's one over there.
Yeah, raise your hand. You got to raise your hand high. Don't be
Raise
shy.
your hand high. There's also.
Hi.
Yeah,
Giovanna
go ahead.
Massarotto from the University of Pennsylvania. I was interested in knowing how would you reconcile the need of a regulatory framework with the need of flexibility that this space requires.
With the need of.
Okay, the regulatory framework and the need of flexibility that this space requires.
Well,
Because-
actually, I think that follows on very nicely to the MICA conversation, which is that I think it's great they put a framework in place. The danger of putting a framework in place early is that you end up constraining the flexibility of the industry to innovate and go where it is. And one of the things that's, I think, been difficult for me to grapple with is that I think a lot of what's happening now is sort of building the infrastructure. A lot of it is very introspective, inward-facing. A lot of it is around trading of digital assets or crypto assets, and it's financialization. But I think a lot of what's going to happen later, and again, I'm a regulator, so what do I know? It might be around digital identity. It might be around social networks. It might be around DAOs as an alternative to corporations. It might be around, data storage. Who knows, right? It's hard for me to predict where things will go, and that's why if we design a regulatory framework that thinks of crypto as being purely financial, we might end up preventing some of those other uses from coming to fruition. So we do have to be careful in how we do it, and I think that's part of what I'm trying to think of. But I think the approach that we're taking now could make it impossible for any of this stuff to blossom. So there's got to be a better way.
One more. Do we have time? Yeah. So let's give anyone. Oh, there's a gentleman in the. Looks like a gentleman. I can't see in the back.
Good morning, Commissioner. Thanks for your remarks. I'm a law student, very fascinated with admin law. But in light of West Virginia versus EPA and the court accepting the major questions doctrine, do you anticipate any challenges for the SEC's regulatory authority?
Well, I think that decision, for those of you who are not law students, West Virginia versus EPA is a recent Supreme Court case that basically said an agency needs to have a clear directive from Congress before it starts doing things that are quite dramatic and maybe outside of what it's typically done in the past. And so that's, I think, a good basic principle, regardless of what the law says on that. I think it's a good basic principle for regulators. You should follow what Congress says, and you shouldn't get out ahead of Congress in doing things. And so I think we could see challenges along those lines, in lots of areas. Crypto might be one of them. But the difference here is that a lot of what we're doing is just, it's through enforcement as opposed to writing rules. There is some rule writing, and I think that might be where you would see those kind of challenges come up, depending on how we write those rules. So we'll see how much it changes the landscape. A lot of people are talking about it because it's a new Supreme Court case, but whether it actually changes what agencies do, we have so much latitude, and the definition of security, as your article, I think, makes very clear, is extremely broad. It's intended to be flexible. It's intended to grow, to encompass new things. And so because of that, and in fact, the definition of exchange is very broad also. And so we have a lot of latitude within which we're operating, but I think it's just good policy to reach out and make sure that Congress wants us to be doing what we're doing, which we don't always wait for Congress.
We're good?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Cohen, Commissioner. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you so much.
And we'll transition to the next panel in just a second.